Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Jungkwan Fan, pronouns he, him, and his, and I'm joining you all from University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the United States. We're here today to just answer some questions from our learners, and Roman Christians is going to be joining me today to do that as well.
Hello, all. Roman Christians here. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm calling from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, where I'm working remotely during this time. One learner posed this question. Can you suggest any courses or resources on the history of LGBTQ oppression that might shed some light on those that were victimized due to their identity throughout history? There are a lot of great resources out there regarding the history of LGBTQ individuals and the oppression that they experienced. Here are some that I would recommend. Coursera has two courses that are relevant to this question that are currently live and online for anyone to access. The first course is AIDS, Fear, and Hope, which has come out of the University of Michigan that explores the history of the AIDS movement. The second course is Queering Identities, which is coming out of the University of Colorado that includes resources and a brief history of LGBTQ rights within the US. I also highly recommend the Library of Congress archive for their LGBTQ Pride History Month. To access this archive, go to loc.gov and search LGBTQ, and you will find a list of different resources regarding the histories, narratives, and stories of LGBTQ individuals and communities. Lastly, the great thing about Pride Month is that this is an opportunity for a lot of online content regarding LGBTQ histories to be pushed out and highlighted on a virtual platform. So I really recommend that you take some time to search online different stories and resources around LGBTQ history. Lastly, if you have access to a local library or even your university library, there might be some LGBTQ history archives that are specific to the region that you are at. And these are great learning points to really understand how LGBTQ individuals have existed in your country, in your region, and continue to exist and thrive today.
So, one of the questions that our learners ask is corporate sponsorship of Pride events always a good thing given that sponsorship can come with conditions or string attached? I would say that the majority of Pride events, especially in large cities, they need to be celebrated, do need sponsorship, corporate sponsorship of large organizations within the city or nationwide to be able to celebrate an event of such large magnitude. However, those conditions and string attached sometimes may not be favorable to the celebration of Pride. So I would say to be cognizant of who those corporate sponsorship are from. Oftentimes, we have people who do celebrate LGBTQ identities and pride on the outside, but have policies or employers who are not, celebrating those identities. And I feel like sometimes we need to be cognizant of like not just what the optics are, but also how the inside of those organizations are operating in terms of the inclusion of LGBTQ identities as well. One of the follow-up questions are from our learners is as follows. For those who have attended past Pride events, has the current trend to monetize Pride led to the diminishment or decline in sense of community? I would say that it really depends again, right, on like who those corporate sponsorships are from. I don't think that the sense community per se has diminished or declined based on the sponsorship. But what I've observed in Pride parades is that they actually increase the sense of belonging and the sense of inclusion from especially those employees who identify as LGBTQ plus within those organizations. So I see a lot of corporate sponsorships walking during the parade with the LGBTQ employees, which I think really reinforces the not just sense of belonging, but affirmation and inclusion of those LGBTQ identities and communities as well within the organization as well. Um, so if you're not walking the walk and just talking the talk about LGBT inclusion, it will be noticeable during Pride of how this is perceived, but also how this is in practice as well. One thing I also want to add to this first question is about, how do we support LGBTQ owned or LGBTQ led businesses and organization as well? So all those sponsorships are coming from large corporations. Um, we need to think more critically about, how do they contribute to LGBTQ communities and lives and experiences, but also to small owned businesses as well that are LGBTQ led. So although, we are talking about being supported by large corporations, I would say to focus also on like locally owned LGBTQ organizations as well. Another questions asked by our learner was as follows. As many nations across the world make strides in creating inclusive societies for LGBTQ plus individuals, what do you think are the next steps for the world as a whole? How can other nations and societies be encouraged to take strides for LGBTQ plus equality? This is a really good question. I think that when we think of improvements across the world, we also can see what is visible and what is not visible as well, and the optics of that. One example of that is the United States Supreme Court ruling in June 2020, um, saying that the discrimination in employment of LGBTQ individual is not legal anymore, which was really a stride that we made here in history around the United States. But while this is happening, we need to be cognizant that same-sex marriage and discrimination policy towards LGBTQ individuals in the workplace have been small wins. There are a lot of improvements still need to happen. The administration here, again, it's 2020, regarding healthcare inclusion for LGBTQ folks, as well as adoption agencies being able to reject LGBTQ potential parents is something that is, we're still being facing right now in the United States. When I think of what is happening globally, we are noticing a lot of changes in favor of same-sex marriages, which again is great. Costa Rica was so far the latest country here in 2020 legalizing that for their citizens. But there's so much more, right? I think when we think of marriage being legal, we need to think more and beyond that. We need to think about, what does adoption looks like? What does healthcare look like? And those could look very differently for different communities within the LGBT communities. As an example of that, our transgender siblings really had different needs than what cisgender lesbian, gay, bisexual folks are going through. So as we think of a collective liberation, we need to be able to think of, how do we advance not just policies, but also practices and mindsets of folks, moving forward as well. A great follow-up questions to inclusion in societies around the world is as follows. Um, what are some existing laws that protect the LGBTQ rights of people? And what are the measures would you recommend to reduce discrimination in different societies? Without really getting to cultural appropriation or imposing ourselves in other cultures, it's really acknowledging what is existing in those different societies around the world and how they are being inclusive. Yes, laws are being passed in favor of LGBTQ folks in some countries, and in others, they are being regressed. We need to think about, more so how are the practices performed and implemented in those different areas of different countries, right? So again, I think that healthcare is something that we need to improve much more on in the inclusion of LGBTQ folks. Um, but really thinking about, you know, we need to not stop here now that same-sex marriage is being legalized across the world, and knowing that some countries right now is still illegal to identify openly as LGBTQ.
Another learner posed the following question: how can a cis hetero person be a better ally to the LGBTQ community? I really appreciate this question because often we don't always have the opportunity to really be in conversation with those from underrepresented communities in order to really understand how we can be most helpful if we don't necessarily identify with those identities or with that community. One caveat I would like to share is that the answer I will provide you may differ from an answer provided from another LGBTQ individual. Something that we really tried to emphasize in the teach out is the fact that LGBTQ as a community is not a monolith. There's multiple experiences and narratives and stories within and identities and in intersectional identities that are represented within the LGBTQ community. And so depending on who you're asking and how you're asking, the answer is going to be really different. For me, I think it's most important for cis hetero allies to really think about and reflect on your own motivation and your own desire and how your own desire to really support and show up for LGBTQ individuals, and thinking through what are your own values and how they align with what it means to interrupt, disrupt bias and oppression against LGBTQ individuals. I think it's really important for allies to take time to reflect and think about who they are and how they can show up in ways that are really authentic and true to what they're trying to do. The second thing that comes to mind in terms of how cis hetero allies can really support and show up for the LGBTQ community is to do your homework. So, this Pride Teach Out is one opportunity of many that allows anyone, but particularly allies, to really understand and explore what is the history of our communities and our identities. In order for cis hetero allies to show up for us, I really want them to understand, how did we come to be? How has our fight and our movement for equal rights, for justice, for equity, what has that looked like? And how did they play a part in that? And even how have allies played a part in the history of our movement? I think those stories are really important for allies to hold on to help motivate them and to help, again, provide them with an avenue to show up authentically for LGBTQ people. Two other things that I want to mention that are important to this question. One is I want allies to recognize that critique is a part of allyship, that the way that you show up and try to support LGBTQ people may be critiqued by those within the community. Critique is not a negative thing. It's actually very positive and powerful, and it's a gift when you hear from those in the community that the way that you're supporting us is not feeling authentic or is not the right way for the moment. So I really want to encourage allies to think about and take in those, recognize that critique's going to be a part of being an ally, and to not let those critiques stop you from continuing to support us, but to actually improve upon and make changes to the way that you're showing up. And taking what we have to say and what we have to provide in your heart and mind. And the last thing I want to share in response to this question is to recognize and name that allyship manifests in a lot of different ways. There's no one right or wrong way to be an ally. You can be an ally by donating to LGBTQ organizations, by showing up to pride marches, by working through your own legislature to pass laws and legislation regarding the rights of LGBTQ individuals, to researching and highlighting stories of LGBTQ individuals from your region, from your country, and their own histories. There's a lot of different ways that one can be an ally to show up for the community. And I think it takes knowledge of and employment of a variety of tactics to be an ally, and really encourage you to think about and consider what works for you. Where is your own knowledge and experience better suited in the movement? And how can you continue to really employ a variety of actions and tactics to support and show up for LGBTQ individuals? One learner also posted the following question: in what ways do classism and racism manifest in Pride celebrations? And what are some ways to combat them? So, one thing that we tried to explore in the Pride Teach Out is really understanding the variety of perspectives that LGBTQ individuals have about Pride celebrations, and the tensions and the conflict and challenges that arise within the location of a celebration for a whole community. And through that exploration, we wanted participants in our teach out to share their own stories about ways that they may not have felt represented or included or fought for within Pride celebrations. Because of that, it's very likely that classism and racism may show up in Pride celebrations that you're hoping to access or that you access on a regular basis. Some ways in which classism may show up in Pride celebrations is having different class fees that prevent individuals from participating in Pride celebrations, the expectation that individuals need to show up in a certain way or have a certain dress to access Pride celebrations, um, the cost of materials and goods that are provided through vendors as a part of Pride celebrations. So when I think about how classism shows up within Pride celebrations, I really think about what are all of those economic obstacles that prevent people from showing up authentically in Pride celebrations. When I think about how racism shows up in Pride celebrations, I'm also really acknowledging and thinking about how, as someone who is white identified, the ways in which my identity and my racial identity is overrepresented in Pride celebrations. Oftentimes, I'll go to a Pride celebration and I will be in majority white spaces where the speakers, the performers, those who are being recognized are majority white. And I think about that as a form of racism. That a way that racism shows up in Pride celebrations is an overrepresentation of specific racial identities, primarily white racial identities, in my own experience. I also think racism can play a part in Pride celebrations and how Pride celebrations are formatted and focused. So, what are the ways in which a Pride celebration is recognizing and honoring the roots of the LGBTQ rights movement and the fact that a lot of Black and Brown folks, specifically transgender and gender nonconforming folks, were a part of the beginning of our movement and are part of the continuation of our movement? How are Pride celebrations recognizing, lifting up, and highlighting these voices, and really reckoning with the history of our movement and ensuring that our movement moving forward is one that really highlights and lifts up queer and trans people of color voices? And so, for me, if a Pride celebration is only focused on celebrating, it's not really recognizing how so many folks within our communities, particularly communities of color, who also identify as queer and trans, all the ways in which they are not being heard, represented, or even have access to our Pride celebrations. So the second part of the question is, what are some ways to combat classism and racism within Pride celebrations? I think it really starts with education and understanding like who is behind the Pride celebrations, who shows up to the Pride celebrations. I think one way to combat it, particularly for organizers of Pride, is to really minimize the economic costs and obstacles that individuals have to be able to show up to Pride celebrations. It's looking at your roster of who's performing, who's speaking, and working to ensure that QTI, POC voices, or queer and trans person of color voices are equitably represented in those who are performing and being a part of your Pride celebrations. It's ensuring that when participants at Pride are making classist or racist comments, that you are interrupting them, that you are educating alongside of them, and you're helping them to realize and recognize how important it is that Pride celebrations are all inclusive and that are really thinking about oppression through a wide, multifaceted, multi-identity or intersectional way. And then the last thing that comes to mind, particularly for Pride organizers, but even for participants, is one way to combat classism or racism is if you have access to class and if you have money, is to really put your money where your values are. What are the ways in which you are funding and sponsoring and donating towards QTI POC led organizations? How are you ensuring that the money you're giving to those who are performing or being a part of the performances is equitably distributed? How are you kind of using your money, but also using your power if you have them to make sure that everyone's represented at the table in the planning of Pride celebration? I think this is a really good question, and it's something that a local pride organization I've been a part of has been wrestling through. And one way in which we approach this question, particularly now, was to think about, if we're having a virtual pride celebration in the midst of an immense movement um, that's recognizing and trying to honor the Black lives that have been lost recently due to police brutality, but also honoring and recognizing the ways in which queer and trans people of color have been part of LGBTQ movements. We have really done a lot of work within our organization to understand the role of racism that is played in Pride celebrations. When we hosted our virtual Pride celebration, we ensured we had a fundraising aspect, and we made sure that all of the funds that we raised through that celebration were then funneled back into the community, specifically into um, Black-led organizations. And we also made ensured that the lineup for performers within our virtual Pride celebration was not majority white. So these are some of the ways in which the local Pride organization I was a part of is working to combat classism and racism. And there's just so much more. So to emphasize an earlier point, I think it starts with self-education. Also starts with being willing to understand why racism, classism show up in Pride celebrations, and thinking about like how do you interrupt and disrupt that for yourself.
One learner pointed out that contributors to this teachout mostly identify as men or non binary. They wanted to know if women are generally excluded or minimized within Pride activities. When I think about it, I think about women always being in the forefront of LGBTQ movements and civil rights movements as well. When we think of the Stonewall riots back in the 1970s, it was Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, two women of color, who really, made strides in terms of providing visibility and acceptance for a lot of LGBTQ folks. Another example of that was Black Lives Matter movement, right? It was co-founded by queer women, Black queer women, who really was able to make strides at the intersection of queer and trans communities as well. When we think of the hashtag of Black queer lives matter, Black trans lives matter, this is something that I think people were really intentional about including the LGBTQ movement at the intersection of race and ethnicity as well. When I also think of marginalized identities, those folks are typically often tapped, and over tapped sometimes in terms of providing their labor and sometimes at no cost. So when I think of, wanting to include as many identities and perspectives as possible, we tried our best in terms of doing that, knowing that we also had a timeline to produce this content. We know that there's always room for improvement, and this is testament really that we can improve in terms of how we provide visibility for anybody, including women, in this teach out. And we know that we can do better. So this is something that we're all going to take back with us and be able to be more inclusive in terms of how this teach out is represented as well.